Dawn broke in a thin, icy light, the kind that bleaches the color from the land before it has the decency to warm it. Clara Whitfield stood barefoot in the pasture, her husband's old coat swallowing her frame, the hem brushing the frost-beat grass. The cold gnawed at her toes, but she stayed, fingers curled around the top rail of the fence, as if the wood might anchor her against what was coming. From the east, she heard the slow, deliberate creak of wagon wheels. That sound had a way of carrying bad news before the words ever arrived. Elias Granger's rig rolled into view. 2 riders flanking it like wolves, escorting a kill. The wagon was polished black, the wheels rimmed with steel. Granger himself stepped down before it even stopped, his silver-tipped cane tapping against the frozen earth, his smile as thin as a winter branch. "Double quotes, Mrs. Whitfield," he said, tipping, his hat in a gesture that suggested courtesy but dripped with ownership. "Thought I'd call before the snow sets in. We ought to talk about that land." Clara's grip on the fence tightened until her knuckles ached. "The land isn't for sale." Granger's eyes traveled over the barn, the paddock, the thin smoke curling from her chimney. Shame to see it run into the ground. "This place needs more than stubbornness to survive the winter. Needs stock, men, a proper hand on the reins. I've got 2 hands." Her voice came out steady, though inside she could hear her pulse, rushing like a river after thaw, behind Granger. The sheriff Tate Holbrook sat, on his gelding, hat pulled low, pretending to examine the sky. She caught his eyes for a heartbeat. He looked away. Tate owed Granger money, or maybe something worse. She'd heard the whispers in town. "I'll make you a fair offer," Granger went on. "Better than what you'll get come spring, after the frosts had its way with your fences." The morning light picked out the lines in his face, carving them deep. He wasn't here to bargain. He was here to measure the ground before he took it. Clara shook her head once. "Come winter's first snow," he said, leaning in so close she could smell the faint clove of his pipe tobacco. "You'll change your mind." He turned, tapping his cane against the wagon's step, and was gone. The riders followed, leaving behind ruts in the frozen dirt like scars. In the silence after, Clara heard the barn door shift in its hinges. A hen clucked from somewhere inside. She told herself she would not be afraid. By noon, she had driven the wagon into town for feed and a length of rope. The streets were hard-packed with frost, the air sharp enough to cut. She could feel eyes on her before she reached the general store. 2 women by the dressmaker's window paused their conversation as she passed. "Won't last the season," one murmured. "Stubborn as her dead husband," the other replied, as if stubbornness were a kind of disease. Clara kept her chin up, but her hands hidden in the folds of her shawl trembled. She could take the work, the cold, even the loneliness, but the slow rot of being doubted, of being measured and found lacking, that was harder to bear. Inside the store, the smell of coffee beans and oiled wood was almost enough to steady her. She gathered her supplies without lingering. At the counter, she became aware of a figure leaning against the far wall. Jonas McGraw, tall, dust-colored hair under a wide-brim hat, his face shadowed except for the glint of his eyes. He was new, enough to town that no one knew what to make of him, but there was a weight about him that made people keep their voices low when he was near. He didn't speak, didn't step forward, just tipped his hat as she turned to leave. Not pity, not mockery, just acknowledgement. It was nothing, and yet it warmed something inside her that had been frostbound since the day her husband died. By the time she rattled home, the sun was gone and the wind had picked up, threading cold fingers through every gap in the walls. She lit the lamp, poured herself a cup of coffee, gone lukewarm, and sat at the table with the feed bill in front of her. The numbers didn't stretch far enough. When she stepped outside to check the gate before bed, she found it mended, hinge tightened, latch oiled, though she hadn't touched it since yesterday. Beside it, a neat bundle of kindling was stacked against the porch rail. No note, no sound in the night, except the distant call of coyotes. She stood there a long time, hands cupped around the kindling's rough edges, and wondered. 3 mornings later, she caught him. Jonas was in the barn, crouched low, checking the hinge on a stall door. He straightened when she entered, the pale light cutting across his face. "You're fixing my barn," she said. "Door wouldn't keep," he replied, not looking at her directly. "I didn't ask for help. You didn't have to." He picked up his tools, slinging them into a worn canvas bag. A rancher shouldn't fight the winter alone. For a moment, she almost told him she wasn't alone, but the words tasted false in her mouth. He moved to pass her, and she stepped aside. Their shoulders brushed, and she felt the solid weight of him, the quiet certainty. The sound of hooves carried across the yard. Clara turned toward the light, spilling from the open barn door. Jonas stepped up beside her, gaze narrowing. Out beyond the pasture fence, 2 riders sat their horses in stillness. She knew them as men. They didn't approach, just circled slow, like buzzards testing the air. Before riding off toward the ridge, Jonas watched them go, jaw tight. Clara's hand tightened around the edge of the stall. The frost on the ground would be gone in a few hours, but the weight in the air stayed. The fight, she knew now, hadn't even begun. Snow came in the night, a quiet burial of the land beneath white that glowed faintly under the dawn. Clara stood on the porch, breath fogging the air, her coat drawn tight against the cold. Jonas was already outside, swinging an axe into a length of pine, the rhythm steady, each split sending up a puff of crystalline dust. There was a wordless comfort in the sound, like a heartbeat in the stillness. The days had slipped into a kind of fragile rhythm. He worked alongside her without fanfare, repairing fences, clearing paths, tending the animals as though he'd always belonged here. She had grown accustomed to the sight of his coat hanging by the door, his boots beside hers. It was a comfort she did not speak of, not even to herself, for fear that naming it might break the spell. The quiet didn't last. By mid-morning, a line of riders appeared along the ridge, dark figures against the snow. Elias Granger was at their head, his cane resting across the pommel of his saddle, the silver tip catching the pale light. They came down slow, deliberate, the hooves muffled in the snow. Jonas set down the axe, wiping his palms on his coat before stepping to Clara's side. "Stay inside," he said, voice low. "I won't hide in my own house," she replied. Granger reined in at the fence eyes, traveling over the yard with the smugness of a man inspecting a prize before taking it. "Mrs. Whitfield," he called, "I told you the snow would bring sense. Have you reconsidered my offer?" She stepped down from the porch, the crunch of snow under her boots sharp in the still air. "The answer's the same." Granger's smile thinned. "You're courting trouble. Accidents happen out here. Livestock goes missing. Fires start." Jonas moved forward then, placing himself between Clara and the fence. "You'll leave this land," he said, his voice carrying in the cold. "Well, you've still got the choice." The men behind Granger shifted in their saddles. Granger chuckled, though his eyes had hardened. Big words from a man with no stake in this ground. "I've got a stake," Jonas replied, and though he didn't look back at her, Clara felt the weight of the words settle in her chest. Granger's gaze flicked between them, assessing something, calculating. "I'll be back before nightfall. Best have your answer ready." They turned as one, riding off through the drifting snow, their silhouettes swallowed by the pale horizon. Inside, Clara stoked the fire higher, the flames snapping and spitting. Jonas sat at the table, checking the rifle's mechanism with deliberate care. She brought out her husband's old shotgun, laying it across her knees. "You know how to use that?" he asked. "I do." He nodded once, approving, and went back to his work. Outside, the snow kept falling, the light draining from the sky in slow degrees. By the time darkness pressed against the windows, the ranch was ringed with lanterns, their glow pooling in the snow like captured moons. Hooves approached again, this time at a gallop. The air outside vibrated with it, the sound carrying into the marrow. Jonas rose, rifle in hand, and moved to the door. Clara followed, her shotgun steady despite the knot in her throat. Elias's men came fast, their shapes resolving from the dark. 4 riders, faces shadowed, breath pluming in the cold. Granger was not among them. They reached the fence, and one man swung down, hand on the latch. Jonas's voice cut through the night. "That gate stays shut." The man laughed, a rough sound. "We're just here to talk." Jonas's rifle barked, the shot slamming into the snow at the front hooves of the man's horse. The animal reared, screaming, and the man tumbled into the drift. Another rider spurred forward, only to pull up short as Clara fired into the ground at his boots, the spray of snow and dirt making him curse and wheel away. The lantern light turned the snow into a shimmering haze, the air alive with the raw scent of gunpowder. The men faltered, muttering to one another. Then, without another word, they turned and rode hard into the night, their shapes dissolving into the storm. The silence that followed was almost heavier than the noise had been. Jonas lowered his rifle. Clara's breath came in clouds. Somewhere, an hour called from the line of trees. They went back inside without speaking. The fire had burned low, its light soft and gold against the walls. Jonas set the rifle aside and sat, his gaze fixed on the flames. Clara sat opposite, her shotgun resting across her lap. For a long time, neither moved. Then Jonas reached across the table, his hand closing over hers, not as a claim, not even as comfort, but as acknowledgement. They had stood their ground, together. She felt the strength of it, the quiet truth. The fight wasn't over in the way. Stories liked to pretend, but something in her had shifted. The ranch still stood, and so did she. And that, for now, was enough. Outside, the snow kept falling, erasing the tracks of the men who'd come to take what wasn't theirs. Somewhere, deep in the winter dark, Clara knew the thaw would come, and with it, a new season neither of them could yet name.